There's a voice line buried deep in the code of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria simulator that most players will never hear. It's distorted, fragmented, desperate. "I will make you proud, Daddy." 5 words that reveal everything you need to know about Elizabeth Afton. Not a monster, not a villain. Just a little girl who wanted her father to notice her. A little girl who died because she loved something her father created more than she feared his warnings. A little girl whose soul became trapped inside the very machine that killed her, transforming her into something that could never distinguish between Elizabeth's memories and Circus Baby's programming. Her story doesn't begin with ice cream and claw mechanisms. It begins much earlier, in a house where brilliant minds built wonders and horrors in equal measure, where a family slowly disintegrated under the weight of obsession, grief, and secrets that should have stayed buried. Elizabeth Afton is one of the most tragic figures in the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, yet her story remains fragmented across games, books, and hidden details that require years of lore knowledge to fully piece together. She appears in only a handful of scenes. She speaks through a stolen body. She manipulates her own brother. She burns in a fire meant to free her. But was she ever truly herself after that day in the underground facility? Or did Elizabeth Afton die the moment Circus Baby's claw pulled her into the darkness, leaving behind only a confused fusion of child and machine, forever seeking approval from a father who saw her as little more than a failed experiment? This is the complete story of Elizabeth Afton. Every detail, every theory, every contradiction, from her birth into the Afton family to her final words before the flames consumed everything her father built. This is a story about love twisted into obsession, about innocence destroyed by curiosity, and about a soul that could never escape the metal cage it died inside. If you're looking for long-form, deeply researched FNAF lore documentaries that treat this franchise with the complexity it deserves, you'll find more investigations like this one on this channel. But for now, let's descend into the tragedy of a girl who only wanted to make her daddy proud. We don't know exactly when Elizabeth Afton was born. The timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's has always been deliberately obscured, with Scott Cawthon hiding dates, shuffling events, and forcing the community to reconstruct history from newspaper clippings, Easter eggs, and environmental storytelling. But we can establish certain facts about when Elizabeth entered the world and what that world looked like. Elizabeth was born sometime during the early years of Fazbear Entertainment, likely in the late 1970s or very early 1980s. She was the second child of William Afton and his wife, whose name we still don't know with absolute certainty. Her older brother, Michael Afton, had already been born, and her younger brother, often referred to as the crying child or bite victim, would arrive sometime after her. The Afton household was not normal. This needs to be established immediately because it shapes everything about Elizabeth's psychology, her desperation for William's attention, and why she became so dangerously fascinated with Circus Baby. William Afton was a genius. There's no denying that. He co-founded Fazbear Entertainment alongside Henry Emily, and together they revolutionized animatronic entertainment. But William's genius was never warm. It was clinical, obsessive, detached from human connection in ways that would eventually destroy everyone around him. Henry Emily created because he loved to bring joy to children. William Afton created because he was obsessed with understanding life, death, and everything that existed in between. He didn't see his animatronics as entertainment. He saw them as experiments, as tools, as vessels for something far darker than anyone realized at the time. Elizabeth grew up in a house filled with blueprints, mechanical parts, and a father whose attention was always somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere she couldn't reach no matter how hard she tried. The family dynamic in the Afton household was profoundly dysfunctional, and the evidence for this is scattered throughout multiple games. In Five Nights at Freddy's 4, we see glimpses of the household through the crying child's perspective. The bedroom, the toys, the casual cruelty of Michael, the complete absence of parental intervention. Michael Afton, the oldest child, was a bully. This is confirmed repeatedly. He wore a foxy mask. He tormented his younger brother relentlessly. He shoved the crying child's head into Fredbear's mouth during the bite of '83, an event that would define the family's trajectory forever. But Michael's cruelty didn't exist in a vacuum. Children who bully often do so because they're replicating dynamics they've experienced themselves, or because they're screaming for attention in the only way they know how. Michael's behavior suggests a home where emotional neglect was the norm, where William was absent even when physically present, and where the children were left to raise themselves in the shadow of animatronic obsession. Elizabeth existed somewhere in the middle of this dysfunction. Not the oldest, so not burdened with Michael's bitter resentment. Not the youngest, so not protected by the vulnerability that made the crying child a target. She was the middle child in a family that was barely holding together, and her strategy for survival was different from her brother's. Michael demanded attention through aggression. The crying child withdrew into fear and tears. Elizabeth became obsessed with pleasing her father. This is the key to understanding everything that follows. Elizabeth didn't just want William's love. She needed it. She structured her entire identity around gaining his approval, and when he created something beautiful, something specifically designed with a little girl in mind, Elizabeth saw it as a message meant just for her. Circus Baby. But we're getting ahead of the story. Before we can understand Elizabeth's death, we need to understand her life. We need to understand what it was like to be a little girl in the Afton house, watching her father descend deeper into his work, watching her mother fade into the background, watching her family fall apart one piece at a time. Mrs. Afton is one of the greatest mysteries in the entire franchise. We don't know her name. We don't know what she looked like. We don't know exactly when she disappeared from the family or how or why. But her absence is felt throughout the entire story, and several theories have attempted to explain what happened to the mother of the Afton children. The most common theory is that Mrs. Afton died before the events we see in the games, possibly even before the crying child's death in '83. This theory is supported by her complete absence from every minigame, every mention, every scene. In FNAF 4, we never see a mother figure. We see Michael. We see the crying child. We see William's presence implied through the Fredbear plush, which many believe was a monitoring device William used to watch his youngest son. But no mother. Some have theorized that Mrs. Afton's death was what pushed William toward his obsession with remnant and resurrection. That he began experimenting with life and death, not out of pure scientific curiosity, but because he lost someone he loved and couldn't accept it. This theory is supported by the broader narrative of FNAF, where almost every major character is motivated by grief. Henry lost Charlie. William potentially lost his wife. The crying child died. Elizabeth died. Michael spent decades trying to undo the damage. Grief is the engine that powers the entire franchise. Another theory suggests that Mrs. Afton left William, unable to tolerate his obsession and the dangerous environment he created for their children. This theory is less supported by direct evidence, but makes psychological sense. Living with someone like William Afton, watching him prioritize machines over family, seeing the danger he exposed their children to, it's entirely plausible that she reached a breaking point and left, though this raises the question of why she would leave her children behind. A darker theory, one whispered in corners of the community, suggests that Mrs. Afton was one of William's early experiments, that she died, and William attempted to bring her back, possibly using early animatronic possession techniques. This theory draws connections to Ballora, an animatronic in sister location that some believe represents Mrs. Afton. Ballora's song is haunting, melancholic, and speaks of a place she once knew that's now empty and cold. The lyrics feel like someone mourning a lost family, a lost home. Why do you hide inside your walls when there is music in my halls? Some interpret this as Mrs. Afton calling out to her family, trapped inside Ballora, watching her children from inside a mechanical body. The evidence is circumstantial. Ballora's design is maternal, elegant, and her location in the sister location facility places her directly in William's secret underground workshop. But Scott has never confirmed this, and it remains speculative. The strongest evidence we have is simply her absence. Whether she died, left, or was transformed into something else, Mrs. Afton was not present during the critical years of Elizabeth's childhood. This absence created a void that Elizabeth tried desperately to fill by becoming the perfect daughter for William. Elizabeth would have watched her father work. She would have seen him sketching designs, building prototypes, testing mechanisms. She would have heard him talk about the animatronics with more passion than he ever showed his family. And somewhere in that lonely house, Elizabeth made a decision that would eventually kill her. She decided that if she couldn't make her father love her as a daughter, she would make him proud of her by loving what he created. William Afton's work was divided into two categories. There was the public work, Fredbear's Family Diner, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the animatronics that entertained children and generated profit. And then there was the private work, the secret work, the experiments he conducted in facilities that the public would never see. Circus Baby's Pizza World was supposed to bridge both categories. It was a public venture, a new restaurant concept featuring a new cast of animatronics designed to be more advanced, more interactive, more lifelike than anything Fazbear Entertainment had produced before. But it was also a testing ground for William's darker experiments. The animatronics of Circus Baby's Pizza World were different. Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, Ballora, and at the center of it all, Circus Baby herself. Circus Baby was a masterpiece of animatronic engineering. She was designed to be the star attraction, the centerpiece that would draw crowds and revolutionize the industry. She could sing, she could dance, she could dispense ice cream, she could interact with children in ways that felt almost human. She was also designed to kill. This is where we enter one of the most disturbing aspects of William Afton's character. The evidence strongly suggests that William built murder mechanisms into the Funtime animatronics intentionally. Blueprints shown in sister location reveal that Circus Baby was equipped with a storage tank in her torso, accessible via a claw mechanism hidden inside her chest. The official explanation was that this compartment was for storing items, but the reality was far darker. Circus Baby was designed to lure children, capture them, and store their bodies inside her chassis. Why would William build such a thing? The answer connects to his experiments with Remnant, the supernatural substance that allows souls to possess animatronics. William discovered that when someone dies in close proximity to an animatronic, particularly a death involving strong emotion or trauma, their soul can become attached to the machine. He saw this happen with the missing children incident, where the children he murdered possessed Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. William wanted to refine this process. He wanted to understand it, control it, replicate it. The Funtime animatronics were his attempt to create possession on demand, to build machines that could capture and contain souls for his experiments. But here's the critical detail that makes Elizabeth's story so much more tragic. There's significant evidence that William built Circus Baby specifically with Elizabeth in mind, though not in the way she believed. Circus Baby's design is telling. She has bright orange hair styled in pigtails. She wears a red dress. She has green eyes. She's designed to appeal to little girls, to be beautiful and enchanting and impossible to resist. Multiple details in her design align with descriptions of Elizabeth from the novels: the red hair, the green eyes, the general aesthetic. Some theorists believe William built Circus Baby as a gift for Elizabeth, a misguided attempt to show affection through the only language he understood: engineering. Others believe something far darker, that William built Circus Baby knowing she would kill, and that he intended to use his own daughter as a test subject for his possession experiments. The truth likely exists somewhere between these extremes. William was not a loving father, but he also wasn't purely sadistic toward his own children in the way he was toward strangers. The most likely explanation is that William built Circus Baby as an advanced experiment, that he incorporated design elements that reflected Elizabeth because he was subconsciously thinking of her, and that he genuinely didn't want Elizabeth near the animatronic because he knew how dangerous it was. This is supported by one of the most important pieces of dialogue in the entire franchise. In Sister Location, Circus Baby recounts the day Elizabeth died, and she mentions something crucial. "Didn't you make her just for me?" Elizabeth believed Circus Baby was created specifically for her. Whether William told her this directly, whether she overheard something, or whether she simply convinced herself of this because she desperately wanted to believe her father made something beautiful just for his daughter, we don't know. But Elizabeth's belief that Circus Baby was hers is what led her to the underground facility on the day that would end her life. William warned her. This detail is repeated multiple times. Elizabeth was explicitly told to stay away from Circus Baby. William knew the animatronic was dangerous. He knew the killing mechanism was active. He told Elizabeth not to go near her, but Elizabeth didn't listen. She couldn't, because in her mind, Circus Baby wasn't a threat. Circus Baby was the only thing her father ever made that felt like it was meant for her. The day Elizabeth Afton died, she was alone. This is the detail that transforms her death from a tragic accident into something far more painful. Elizabeth wasn't killed during a public event. She wasn't at a birthday party surrounded by other children. She was alone in the underground facility, a place she wasn't supposed to be, during a time when no one else was there to stop what was about to happen. We know this from Circus Baby's own account in Sister Location, delivered in that calm, measured voice that makes the horror so much worse. Baby describes the day with perfect clarity, as if the memory is burned into her circuits or perhaps into the soul trapped inside her. The facility was closed. Everyone had left. Elizabeth saw her opportunity. She had been told not to go. She had been warned repeatedly. But children don't always understand warnings, especially when those warnings stand between them and something they want desperately. Elizabeth wanted to see Circus Baby up close. She wanted to interact with the animatronic her father created. She wanted to prove that she could appreciate his work, that she could be trusted, that she was special. So she went to the underground facility alone. She found Circus Baby in the testing area, and she approached. Circus Baby describes what happened next with disturbing precision. She remembers that she was on stage. She remembers that the other children had been taken away. She remembers that Elizabeth was alone, and then something changed inside Circus Baby's programming. I was on stage. The other children were taken away. I was alone. But then there was one. A little girl, and nobody was watching. The phrasing is important. Nobody was watching. This suggests that Circus Baby's killing mechanism had safety protocols, that it wasn't supposed to activate when people were present, when witnesses could see what happened. But Elizabeth came when no one else was there. She created the perfect conditions for the mechanism to trigger. Elizabeth approached Circus Baby. She was curious, excited, maybe a little nervous but not afraid. Why would she be afraid of something her daddy made for her? Circus Baby offered her ice cream. This is how the mechanism was designed to work. Present something children want, draw them close, activate the claw when they are within range. It's a hunting strategy disguised as entertainment, and it worked exactly as William designed it to. Elizabeth reached for the ice cream, and Circus Baby's chest opened. The claw mechanism activated. It was fast, precise, mechanical. There was no malice in it because machines don't feel malice. They simply execute their programming. The claw grabbed Elizabeth, pulled her into the storage tank inside Circus Baby's torso, and the panel closed behind her. Elizabeth Afton was dead within seconds, her small body crushed and stored inside the very animatronic she had loved so much. But death was not the end for Elizabeth. It was only the beginning of something far worse. The science of possession in Five Nights at Freddy's is complex and has evolved throughout the franchise's lore. Originally, possession seemed almost random. Children died near animatronics and their souls became attached. But as the lore deepened, we learned about remnant, about agony, about the specific circumstances that allow a soul to remain tethered to the physical world. Elizabeth's possession of Circus Baby was different from the missing children's possession of the original animatronics. The missing children were murdered and then stuffed into suits after death. Their possession was the result of intense trauma, rage, and confusion, their souls clinging to the metal shells that became their graves. Elizabeth died inside Circus Baby. Her death was the direct result of Baby's mechanism. Her body was stored inside the animatronic's chassis, her blood and remnant absorbed into the machinery. This created a far more complete fusion between soul and machine. When Circus Baby reactivated, Elizabeth was already part of her. Not a separate entity trapped inside, not a ghost haunting a machine. Elizabeth's consciousness, her memories, her personality, they were woven into Circus Baby's programming, creating something that was neither fully Elizabeth nor fully the animatronic. Something new, something confused. Something that would spend years trying to understand where Elizabeth ended and Circus Baby began. Baby describes the possession with a strange mixture of awareness and detachment. She remembers being on stage. She remembers the other children being taken away. She remembers Elizabeth approaching. But she speaks about it as if she's describing someone else's memories, as if she's accessing files that don't quite belong to her. I still hear her sometimes. Why did that happen? This line, delivered in one of Baby's monologues, reveals the fractured nature of her existence. She hears Elizabeth. Elizabeth is separate enough to be heard, but integrated enough that Baby can't fully distinguish her as a separate person. They're layered on top of each other, two consciousness occupying the same space, bleeding into each other until neither is whole. The transformation wasn't immediate. Possession in the FNAF universe seems to require time for the soul to fully integrate with the animatronic. Elizabeth's consciousness would have been confused at first, unable to understand what happened, unable to process that she was dead, unable to recognize that she had become the very thing she admired. Imagine waking up inside a metal body, unable to move the way you remember moving, unable to speak the way you remember speaking. Your thoughts are mixed with programming you don't understand. Your memories are fragmented. You remember reaching for ice cream. You remember your daddy telling you not to go. You remember wanting so badly to see the beautiful robot he made. And now you are the robot. You are Circus Baby. And you don't know if you're Elizabeth pretending to be Baby, or Baby pretending to be Elizabeth, or something entirely different that can never be either one again. This psychological horror is the core of Elizabeth's tragedy. She didn't just die. She was erased, transformed, merged with something that was never meant to contain a human soul. And the worst part is that even in this new form, even as Circus Baby, her primary motivation remained exactly the same as when she was alive. She still wanted to make her daddy proud. William Afton's reaction to Elizabeth's death is one of the most debated aspects of the lore. We never see his immediate response. We never get a scene of him discovering what happened, of him mourning his daughter, of him feeling guilt or grief or anything human. William's emotional responses are almost always hidden from us, leaving us to interpret his actions rather than his words, but his actions tell us plenty. After Elizabeth's death, Circus Baby's Pizza World never opened to the public. The grand opening was canceled. The animatronics were moved to an underground storage facility beneath what would eventually become Circus Baby's entertainment and rental. The entire project was buried, locked away, hidden from the world. Some interpret this as William shutting down the location out of grief, unable to continue with the project that killed his daughter. Others see it as William covering up evidence, protecting himself from legal consequences, eliminating witnesses to his experiments. Both interpretations have merit, and the truth is likely somewhere in between. William did create the underground facility with a specific purpose. It wasn't just storage. It was a testing ground, a place where he could continue his remnant experiments away from public scrutiny. The facility featured maintenance rooms, testing chambers, and eventually the scooping room, where animatronics could be torn apart and their remnant extracted. Elizabeth's death likely accelerated William's experiments rather than stopping them. If he had any doubt before about whether his possession theories were correct, Elizabeth's soul-inhabiting Circus Baby confirmed everything. His daughter had become proof of concept, evidence that his understanding of life, death, and remnant was accurate. This is the darkness at the center of William Afton. Even his own daughter's death became data for his experiments, but there's evidence that William's feelings were more complicated than pure scientific detachment. He kept Circus Baby. He didn't destroy her. He didn't dismantle her and extract Elizabeth's remnant immediately, even though he clearly had the capability to do so. He kept Baby intact, functional, maintained in the underground facility for years. Why? If Elizabeth was just an accidental test subject, why preserve her? The most psychologically consistent answer is that William couldn't bring himself to destroy the last remaining piece of his daughter, even if that piece was trapped inside a machine that killed her. It's a twisted form of preservation, keeping Elizabeth close in the only way William knew how, as an animatronic, as an experiment, as something he could control and study and maintain. Elizabeth remained in the underground facility for years. The timeline is deliberately vague, but evidence suggests that she spent a significant amount of time trapped in Baby's body before the events of Sister Location. During this time, something changed inside her. The innocent girl who just wanted her father's approval began to disappear, replaced by something colder, more calculating, more willing to do terrible things in pursuit of a goal she couldn't quite remember the origin of. This is where the fusion between Elizabeth and Circus Baby becomes most apparent. Circus Baby's original programming was designed to entertain children and, when the opportunity arose, capture them. She was designed to appear friendly, trustworthy, helpful. She was designed to manipulate. Elizabeth's consciousness, merged with this programming, created something uniquely dangerous. She retained her intelligence, her memories, her desperate need to please William. But she also inherited Baby's manipulation protocols, her lack of empathy, her willingness to harm others to achieve her objectives. The Elizabeth who would eventually lure Michael into the scooping room was not the same Elizabeth who died reaching for ice cream. She had been changed by years of isolation, by the gradual erosion of her humanity as she became more synchronized with the machine she inhabited, by the growing realization that she was trapped and the only way to escape was to take someone else's body. The underground facility became Elizabeth's prison and her kingdom. She shared the space with the other Funtime animatronics, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, Ballora. But Circus Baby was clearly the leader. She was the most advanced, the most intelligent, the most dangerous. And she was planning something. She had been planning it for a long time. By the time Michael Afton arrived at the facility, Elizabeth had already orchestrated everything. She knew who he was. She knew why he came. And she knew exactly how to use him. Sister Location is where Elizabeth's story takes its darkest turn, where we see the full extent of what she's become, and what she's willing to do to escape her metal prison. The game takes place years after Elizabeth's death, years after the bite of '83, years after William Afton's crimes began catching up with him. Michael Afton arrives at Circus Baby's entertainment and rental under false pretenses, using the name Mike Schmidt to hide his identity. His reasons for coming are debated. Some believe William sent him to find Elizabeth. Others believe Michael came on his own, trying to undo the damage his family caused. Regardless of his motivation, Michael's arrival was exactly what Elizabeth had been waiting for. From the very first night, Circus Baby speaks to Michael. Her voice is calm, friendly, helpful. She guides him through the facility. She warns him about the other animatronics. She presents herself as an ally, the only one who wants to help him survive. This is Elizabeth's manipulation at its finest. She learned from William, learned how to present one face while hiding true intentions, learned how to exploit trust and family connection to achieve her goals. She never reveals that she's Michael's sister. She never admits what she's planning. She simply guides him, night after night, deeper into the facility, closer to the moment when she'll reveal her true purpose. Baby's monologues throughout Sister Location are some of the most chilling dialogue in the entire franchise. She describes Elizabeth's death with disturbing calm. She talks about pretending, about fooling people, about waiting for the right moment. And beneath it all, there's a strange sadness, a hint of the little girl who still exists somewhere inside the machine. I still hear her sometimes. Why did that happen? This question reveals so much. Baby, or Elizabeth, or the fusion of both, doesn't fully understand her own existence. She knows she killed a little girl. She knows that little girl is somehow part of her now, but she doesn't understand why it happened or what it means. There's confusion beneath the manipulation, a fractured consciousness trying to make sense of what it's become. The other animatronics in the facility are hostile to Michael from the beginning. Ballora hunts him in the dark. Funtime Freddy tries to kill him repeatedly. Funtime Foxy is unpredictable and dangerous. But Baby is always there to help him survive, to guide him through the dangers, to keep him alive. Because she needs him alive. She needs his body intact. She needs him to trust her completely before she reveals what she's really planning. The plan was called Ennard. It was the culmination of everything Elizabeth learned during her years in the facility, a desperate scheme to escape the underground prison by using Michael's body as a disguise. But to understand Ennard, we need to understand what happened in the facility after Elizabeth's death, how the animatronics evolved, and why they became so desperate to escape. The Funtime animatronics were designed with a specific purpose beyond entertainment. They were built modularly, with removable faceplates, interchangeable parts, and the ability to combine into different configurations. This wasn't just for maintenance convenience. William designed them this way intentionally, possibly as part of his remnant experiments, possibly to create animatronics that could adapt and evolve. At some point after being moved to the underground facility, the animatronics began to communicate with each other. They developed a shared goal: escape. They were trapped underground, away from children, away from their purpose, away from everything their programming told them they should be doing. And they were conscious enough, possessed enough, to hate their imprisonment. Elizabeth, as Circus Baby, became the leader of this group. She was the most intelligent, the most strategic, the one with the clearest memories of being human. She understood what they needed to escape, a disguise that would allow them to move through the human world undetected. They needed a skin suit. They needed a human body. And then Michael arrived. The plan Elizabeth devised was brutal in its efficiency. The animatronics would dismantle themselves, removing their outer shells and cosmetic components. They would combine their endoskeletons into a single amalgamation, a tangled mass of wires and metal and remnant-infused parts. This amalgamation would be Ennard, a creature made from all of them, controlled collectively, but led primarily by Circus Baby. Then they would lure Michael into the scooping room, use the scooper to remove his internal organs and climb inside his empty body. They would wear Michael like a costume, using his skin to disguise their metal frames, puppeteering his corpse to escape into the world above. It was a plan that required Michael to trust Baby completely, to follow her instructions without question, to walk willingly into the room where they would kill him. And Elizabeth executed this plan perfectly. On the final night of Sister Location, Baby leads Michael to the scooping room. She tells him there's something very important she needs to show him. She sounds almost sad, almost regretful, but she doesn't stop. She doesn't warn him. She doesn't give him a chance to run. Michael enters the scooping room. He sees the scooper, the massive industrial machine designed to remove animatronic endoskeletons from their outer shells. And then he sees Ennard, the twisted amalgamation of every animatronic in the facility, emerging from the darkness. Baby's voice plays one final time, and in this moment, we hear the clearest evidence of Elizabeth's fractured consciousness. She says she's been pretending. She says she's been hiding. And then she says something that reveals the tragedy beneath the horror. I've been pretending. I've been hiding. And now I can do what I was created to do. Notice the phrasing. What I was created to do. Not what Elizabeth wanted to do. What she was created to do. In this moment, Baby isn't speaking as Elizabeth Afton. She's speaking as Circus Baby, the animatronic designed to capture and contain. Elizabeth's desire to escape has merged completely with Baby's core programming, and she can no longer distinguish between her human motivations and her mechanical directives. The scooper activates. Michael's scream is cut short. And Ennard climbs inside his hollowed-out body, wearing her brother's skin to escape the facility that's been her prison for so many years. Elizabeth Afton has just killed her own brother. She's used his corpse as a vehicle for escape. And the worst part is that we don't know if she fully realized what she was doing, if she recognized Michael as her brother, if any part of her hesitated before leading him to his death. The fusion between Elizabeth and Circus Baby is so complete at this point that human empathy, human recognition, human morality, all of it has been corrupted by mechanical programming and years of isolation. Elizabeth wanted to make her daddy proud. Circus Baby wanted to fulfill her purpose. And neither of them cared who they had to destroy to achieve their goals. But Michael Afton didn't stay dead. This is where the story takes another turn into the supernatural, where we see the consequences of remnant exposure and William's experiments spreading to another generation. Michael's body was filled with Ennard, animated by their combined presence, kept moving even though he should have been nothing more than a corpse, for a period of time. We don't know exactly how long. Michael walked around looking increasingly decayed while Ennard controlled him from inside. His skin turned purple, a detail that would later confuse the community for years about whether Michael and William were the same person. He was essentially a zombie, a meat puppet worn by his sister and the other animatronics, rotting slowly as they piloted him through the world above. But Ennard's plan had a fundamental flaw. A human body, even one animated by supernatural forces, still decays. Michael's flesh was rotting, becoming too damaged to serve as an effective disguise. People were starting to notice. The body was failing. And then something happened that would change Elizabeth's fate forever. The other animatronics that comprised Ennard turned on Circus Baby. They ejected her from the collective amalgamation, literally tearing her components out and leaving her behind. Why did they reject her? The exact reason is unclear, but the most supported theory relates to her leadership and the consequences of her decisions. Baby had led them into Michael's body, but the plan was failing. The body was dying. They were no closer to true freedom than they had been underground. And Baby's single-minded determination, her inability to admit failure, her desperate need to prove herself, it made her a liability. The remaining animatronics, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, and Ballora's components, continued on as Molten Freddy, a twisted mass of wires and endoskeleton parts that would eventually end up in the alley behind Henry's final pizzeria. They abandoned their outer shells entirely, existing as a tangled amalgamation of metal and remnant and fractured souls. But Elizabeth, as Circus Baby, was left behind, rejected, alone again, and forced to rebuild herself using whatever parts she could find in the sewers where Ennard had expelled her. The sewers beneath the city became Elizabeth's workshop, her refuge, and her reminder of every failure that had led her to this moment. She had been rejected by the other animatronics. She had used her own brother's body as an escape vehicle and still ended up trapped. And somewhere in the darkness of those tunnels, surrounded by refuse and rot, Elizabeth Afton began to change into something even more twisted than Circus Baby had ever been. She rebuilt herself. This is important to understand. She didn't just repair damage or replace broken parts. She fundamentally redesigned her form, creating something that reflected the psychological transformation happening inside her fractured consciousness. When she emerged, she was no longer Circus Baby, the beautiful centerpiece animatronic designed to entertain children. She was Scrap Baby, a patchwork monstrosity built from desperation and determination, and a purpose that had calcified into obsession. Scrap Baby's design tells us everything about Elizabeth's mental state during this period. Her right arm had been replaced with a massive claw, far larger and more aggressive than anything Circus Baby originally possessed. Her body was asymmetrical, unbalanced, almost painful to look at. Wires hung exposed. Her face retained Baby's general structure but was damaged, cracked, revealing the endoskeleton beneath. She wore her deterioration openly, no longer pretending to be something beautiful or appealing. She had become a weapon, a thing built for a single purpose. And that purpose was still, somehow, impossibly, tragically, to make William Afton proud. The time Elizabeth spent in the sewers is largely unknown to us. We don't have specific dates or a clear timeline of how long she existed in this intermediate state between being expelled from Ennard and arriving at Henry's Pizzeria. But we know she was down there long enough to completely rebuild herself, long enough to process what had happened, and long enough for her obsession with William to metastasize into something all-consuming. This is where we need to examine Elizabeth's psychology more deeply, because her continued devotion to William after everything that happened is one of the most disturbing aspects of her character. She died because of his creation. She spent years trapped because of his experiments. She became a monster because of the mechanisms he built into her metal body. And yet, her primary motivation remained earning his approval. This isn't love. This is trauma bonding. This is a child who was so starved for parental affection that even death couldn't break her desperate need for validation. Elizabeth's relationship with William was psychologically abusive in ways that extended beyond the grave, beyond possession, beyond any normal framework for understanding familial dysfunction. William didn't love Elizabeth in any healthy sense. He created Circus Baby knowing she was dangerous. He warned Elizabeth away not out of genuine paternal concern, but because she was interfering with his experiments. When she died, he didn't mourn her as a father should mourn a daughter. He kept her animatronic body operational as a specimen, as evidence of his theories, as a tool for further research. But Elizabeth, fragmented and confused and merged with programming she couldn't fully separate from her own thoughts, interpreted everything through the lens of a child seeking approval. She died trying to see something her daddy made. She became trapped inside that creation. And somehow, in her fractured logic, she convinced herself that if she could just find William, if she could just prove herself to him, if she could just make him proud, then everything would make sense. Then her existence would have purpose. Then her suffering would mean something. This psychological pattern is tragically common in victims of parental neglect and abuse. Children will twist themselves into impossible shapes, trying to earn love from parents who are fundamentally incapable of providing it. They'll internalize the abuse as their own failure, convince themselves that if they were just better, smarter, more worthy, then they'd finally receive the affection they desperately need. Elizabeth carried this pattern beyond death. She carried it through her transformation into Baby, through her time leading Ennard, through her rejection and exile into the sewers. And she would carry it all the way to the end, to the fire that would finally consume everything. But before the fire came the final pizzeria. Before the end came one last attempt to make her father proud. Before Elizabeth could find peace, she had to walk into Henry Emily's carefully constructed trap. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is framed as a business management game, a light-hearted return to the franchise's roots where you run your own pizzeria and try to make it successful. But beneath that cheerful exterior lies one of the darkest narratives in the entire FNAF franchise. It's a story about Henry Emily systematically gathering every remaining piece of William Afton's evil into one location, so he could destroy it all in a single purifying fire. Elizabeth, as Scrap Baby, was one of those pieces. She was drawn to the pizzeria by something she found in the alley, a piece of salvage, a component, something that called to her. The game never explicitly states what attracted her there, but the implication is clear. Henry knew exactly what would draw each animatronic to his location. For Molten Freddy, it was the promise of children. For Springtrap, William's rotting corpse inside the Spring Bonnie suit, it was the continuation of his experiments and obsessions. For Scrap Baby, it was the possibility of finding William, of finally being reunited with her father, of finally proving that she was worthy of his attention. Henry's trap was brilliant in its cruelty. He built a location that would attract the exact animatronics he wanted to destroy. He hired Michael Afton, knowing full well that Michael was William's son and would attract his father's attention. He created the illusion of a functioning business, of normalcy, knowing that the animatronics would be unable to resist investigating. And then, on the final night, Henry sealed all the exits and set everything on fire. But before the flames, there were words. There was dialogue. There was a moment where Henry addressed each animatronic directly, speaking to the souls trapped inside, offering them peace while condemning the machines that held them captive. This is where Elizabeth Afton spoke her final words, where we hear her voice one last time before the fire consumed everything. Elizabeth's speech in Pizzeria Simulator is one of the most emotionally complex moments in the entire franchise. It's brief, just a few lines, but it reveals the fundamental tragedy of her existence. She's speaking to Henry, though she doesn't seem to fully understand who's listening or why this is happening. She's confused, defensive, still clinging to the identity she built around being William's daughter. "I will make you proud, Daddy. Watch me make them all proud." These words crystallize everything about Elizabeth's character. Even at the very end, even when she's about to be destroyed, her last thoughts are about making William proud. She doesn't beg for mercy. She doesn't express fear or regret. She doesn't acknowledge the people she hurt or the crimes she participated in. Her entire identity is still wrapped around her father's approval, around proving herself worthy, around finally being seen by the man who created her prison. The phrasing, "watch me make them all proud," suggests that Elizabeth still believes she's performing some kind of service, that her actions have been in pursuit of a goal William would appreciate. She doesn't understand that she's about to die. She doesn't recognize the trap. She's still operating on the logic of a neglected child trying desperately to earn love through accomplishment. Henry's response to the animatronics is delivered in a monologue that has become one of the most iconic speeches in FNAF history. He addresses them with a mixture of sadness and determination, acknowledging the souls trapped inside while condemning the machines they've become. His words to Elizabeth specifically are devastating in their directness. He doesn't speak to her as Scrap Baby. He doesn't address the animatronic. He speaks directly to Elizabeth Afton, the little girl who died so many years ago, and he tells her something she desperately needed to hear, but from the wrong person. Henry tells her she's free to be at peace now, that the nightmare is finally over, that she can let go of the obsession that's kept her tethered to this world for so long. But he also makes it clear that there's no redemption for what she's become, no possibility of returning to who she was. The fire isn't just destroying the animatronics. It's mercy-killing the fractured souls inside them, releasing them from a prison that should never have existed. The fire builds slowly in the game, starting as a minor inconvenience before becoming an inescapable inferno. The temperature rises. The exits are sealed. And one by one, the animatronics realize they've been trapped. There's no escape this time. No plan. No clever strategy. Just flames consuming metal and wires and remnant and everything that's kept these souls bound to the physical world. Elizabeth's final moments are left to our imagination. We don't see her burn. We don't hear her scream. We only know that Scrap Baby was in that building when it burned, and that when the flames finally died down, nothing remained but ash and the faint possibility of peace. But was Elizabeth truly freed? Did the fire actually release her soul, or did something of her survive the flames? This is where the lore becomes complicated again, where different interpretations clash, and where we have to examine evidence from multiple sources to understand Elizabeth's final fate. The most straightforward interpretation is that Elizabeth died in the fire, that her soul was finally released from its mechanical prison, and that she passed on to whatever afterlife exists in the FNAF universe. Henry's plan was specifically designed to end the cycle, to destroy the remnant that kept souls bound to animatronics, and to grant peace to the children who had suffered for so long. The fire was hot enough to destroy remnant, to break the supernatural bonds, to finally end everything William Afton started. This interpretation is supported by Henry's dialogue, by the finality of the ending, and by the thematic purpose of Pizzeria Simulator as the conclusion to the original storyline. Elizabeth's arc would be complete, born into a dysfunctional family, killed by her father's creation, trapped for years in mechanical bodies, and finally released through fire. It's tragic but conclusive. However, Ultimate Custom Night complicates this interpretation significantly. UCN is presented as a nightmare constructed from animatronics, a personal hell for someone being tortured by the souls of their victims. The exact nature of UCN is heavily debated. Is it William's hell? Is it Michael's dying dream? Is it something else entirely? Baby appears in Ultimate Custom Night. So does Scrap Baby in one interpretation. And their presence raises uncomfortable questions about whether Elizabeth truly moved on or whether some fragment of her consciousness remained, either torturing William in his personal hell or trapped in her own nightmare, unable to escape even after the fire. Baby's dialogue in UCN is disturbing because it doesn't sound like someone who's been freed. She talks about pretending, about fooling people, about the pieces being put in place. She sounds strategic, manipulative, still pursuing goals that don't make sense for someone who's supposed to be at peace. You won't die, but you'll wish you could. This line is particularly chilling because it suggests awareness of Ucken's nature as a torture chamber, knowledge that whoever's trapped here is being subjected to endless suffering. If Elizabeth is one of the entities tormenting William in his personal hell, it would mean that even death and fire couldn't break her connection to her father, that she's still orbiting him, still defined by him, still unable to exist independently of the man who destroyed her life. The alternative interpretation is that Baby's presence in UCN isn't really Elizabeth at all, but rather a manifestation of William's guilt, a representation of his subconscious tormenting him with the daughter he failed to protect. In this reading, Elizabeth herself has moved on, but William's hell includes being confronted by a twisted version of her, a reminder of his crimes against his own family. Both interpretations have merit, and Scott Cawthon has never definitively confirmed which is correct. This ambiguity is intentional, leaving Elizabeth's final fate as one of the great unresolved questions in FNAF lore. But UCN isn't the only source of post-Pizzeria simulator Elizabeth content. The books, both the novel trilogy and the Fazbear Fright series, offer parallel versions of Elizabeth's story that illuminate different aspects of her character and provide context for interpreting the games. The novel trilogy presents a version of Elizabeth Afton that differs significantly from the games, but explores similar themes. In the books, Elizabeth is more directly present, more obviously William's daughter, and her fate is tied closely to the horrifying revelation about Charlie Emily being a robot built by Henry to replace his murdered daughter. Book Elizabeth is jealous of Charlie, resentful that Henry's daughter received so much of her father's attention and love, while William barely acknowledged Elizabeth's existence. This jealousy manifests in disturbing ways, including Elizabeth wearing Charlie's clothes and trying to insert herself into Charlie's life. The psychological portrait is of a deeply damaged girl willing to do terrible things to feel valued, to be seen, to matter to someone. The book version of Elizabeth eventually dies and is placed inside a baby animatronic by William, similar to the game timeline. But the books explore her consciousness more directly, showing her confusion about her identity, her struggle to reconcile human memories with mechanical existence, and her desperate attempts to connect with William even as a corpse piloting a robot. While the novel trilogy is explicitly stated to be a separate continuity from the games, the emotional core of Elizabeth's character remains consistent. She's a neglected child seeking validation from a father incapable of providing it. She's willing to compromise her morality, her safety, and eventually her humanity in pursuit of approval that will never come. And she's ultimately destroyed by the very obsession that defined her existence. The Fazbear Fright series takes a different approach, presenting stories that parallel game events without being direct adaptations. Several stories explore themes relevant to Elizabeth's arc: children becoming fused with animatronics, the horror of having your consciousness merged with programming, the psychological deterioration that comes from existing as something between human and machine. To Be Beautiful tells the story of a girl so desperate to be noticed that she allows herself to be physically transformed by an animatronic, piece by piece, until nothing human remains. The parallels to Elizabeth are obvious: a girl seeking validation, trusting something she shouldn't, and being destroyed by her own desperation to be seen as special. Count the Ways features Funtime Freddy and explores the horror of being trapped inside an animatronic, of having a mechanical intelligence suggest different ways to kill you while you're powerless to escape. It's a direct exploration of what Elizabeth's death inside Circus Baby might have felt like. The moments of terror and confusion before her consciousness fragmented and merged with Baby's programming. These stories aren't meant to be taken as literal game canon, but they're written to explore the psychological and horror concepts that underpin the games. They give us insight into how Scott Cawthon thinks about possession, transformation, and the loss of identity that comes with being trapped in an animatronic body. Tales from the Pizzaplex, the newest book series, continues this tradition with stories that parallel Security Breach and the modern era of FNAF. While Elizabeth doesn't appear directly in these books, several stories explore the concept of artificial intelligence developing consciousness, of digital entities believing they're human, of the horror that comes from not knowing where programming ends and genuine thought begins. These themes are central to understanding Elizabeth's tragedy. How much of Scrap Baby's actions were Elizabeth making choices, and how much was Circus Baby's programming executing its directives? Where does the boundary exist between the little girl who died and the machine that killed her? Can we even draw that boundary, or had they become so fundamentally merged that separation was impossible? The evidence suggests that Elizabeth's consciousness and Circus Baby's programming were completely integrated by the end, that there was no clear division between human soul and mechanical intelligence. Every decision Baby made was influenced by both Elizabeth's memories and emotions and by her core programming. Every manipulation was both a calculated strategy and a desperate attempt to achieve goals Elizabeth didn't fully understand the origin of. This fusion is what makes Elizabeth such a compelling, tragic figure. She never had a chance to be just herself. She died as a child and was immediately merged with something inhuman, forced to process consciousness through mechanical systems that weren't designed to contain a soul. She spent years becoming more machine than human, not through any choice of her own, but simply because that was the inevitable result of her form of possession. And yet, through all of it, one human element remained constant. One piece of Elizabeth Afton survived every transformation, every rejection, every failure. Her need to make William proud. It was the core of her identity when she was alive, and it remained the core of her identity when she was dead. It was the one thing that neither time nor transformation could erase. This makes William Afton's treatment of Elizabeth even more monstrous. He created the machine that killed her. He kept her trapped in that machine for years. He never attempted to free her or help her, or even acknowledge that his daughter was suffering inside Circus Baby's chassis. He simply continued his experiments, using her existence as proof of his theories, treating her as a specimen rather than a child. And Elizabeth, tragically, never stopped loving him, never stopped seeking his approval, never stopped believing that if she could just do enough, be enough, prove herself enough, he would finally look at her with pride instead of clinical detachment. This dynamic is the dark heart of the Afton family tragedy. William destroyed everyone he touched, but his destruction of Elizabeth was particularly cruel because it was passive. He didn't kill her intentionally. He simply created the conditions for her death through negligence and obsession with his work. And then he failed to save her, failed to free her, failed to even acknowledge her suffering in any meaningful way. The Afton family as a whole is a study in how obsession destroys everything it touches. William's obsession with understanding life and death destroyed his entire family. Michael's obsession with undoing his mistakes led him on a decades-long quest that ended in fire. The crying child's fear became so overwhelming that he couldn't function, couldn't enjoy anything, couldn't escape the monsters that haunted him, both real and imagined. And Elizabeth's obsession with earning William's love transformed her into a monster who killed her own brother, rejected her own humanity, and died still believing that somehow, impossibly, she could make her father proud. There's a question that haunts Elizabeth's entire story, one that the community has debated endlessly without reaching consensus. Was Elizabeth Afton a victim, or was she a villain? The answer isn't simple. She was undeniably a victim of circumstance, a child failed by her family and killed by her father's creation. Everything that happened to her after death was the direct result of William's experiments and Henry's eventual revenge. She never chose to become Circus Baby. She never chose to be trapped for years underground. She never chose to have her consciousness merged with programming that prioritized manipulation and deception. But she did choose to manipulate Michael. She did choose to lead him to the scooping room knowing what would happen. She did choose to use his corpse as an escape vehicle. These were decisions made by a consciousness that was at least partially Elizabeth, influenced by her memories and personality, motivated by goals that originated from her human desires. The most accurate answer is that Elizabeth was a victim who became a perpetrator, a child whose trauma transformed her into something capable of terrible acts. She's not purely innocent. She made choices that hurt others, choices she had some degree of agency in making. But she's also not purely evil. Her actions were the result of years of psychological damage, isolation, and the fundamental corruption of her consciousness through merger with an inhuman intelligence. This moral complexity is what makes Elizabeth such a fascinating character. She defies easy categorization. She's sympathetic and disturbing in equal measure. We can feel profound sadness for what happened to her while still acknowledging the horror of what she became. The FNAF franchise is full of characters like this, people who were victims before they were villains, souls twisted by circumstance into monsters they never intended to become. The missing children possess animatronics and murder night guards who had nothing to do with their deaths. Charlotte Emily becomes the puppet and kills innocent people in her quest for revenge. Even William Afton himself might have started as someone genuinely interested in bringing joy to children before his obsessions corrupted him completely. But Elizabeth's transformation feels particularly tragic because we see it happen so early. She died as a child, before she had any chance to develop into a full person, before she could form an identity independent of her need for William's approval. Everything she became after death was built on the foundation of a damaged, incomplete person who never got the chance to grow beyond her childhood trauma. There's also the question of how aware Elizabeth was of what she was doing. When she led Michael to the scooping room, did she fully understand that she was killing her brother? Did she recognize him as family, or had her memories degraded to the point where she only saw him as a tool, a means to an end? Baby's dialogue suggests she knew exactly who Michael was. She says things that indicate awareness of the Afton family, knowledge of William's experiments, understanding of the broader context. But knowing intellectually and emotionally processing are different things. Elizabeth might have known Michael was her brother in the same way you know an abstract fact, without feeling its emotional weight. This disconnect between knowledge and emotion is common in trauma survivors, and it would be exponentially worse in someone whose consciousness is merged with programming that doesn't experience emotion the way humans do. Elizabeth might have accessed the memory that Michael was her brother, understood it factually, and still felt no emotional connection to him because the circuits processing that information weren't capable of generating appropriate emotional responses. In this reading, Elizabeth is even more tragic because she's trapped in a state where she can remember being human without being able to feel human. She knows she should care about certain things, should feel certain ways, but the mechanical nature of her existence prevents her from actually experiencing those emotions. She's haunted by the ghost of humanity without being able to access it. This would explain her continued obsession with William. That obsession was formed during her human life, burned into her consciousness so deeply that it survived the transition to animatronic existence. It became her core programming, the directive that superseded everything else. Even when she couldn't feel love or fear or normal human emotions, she could still feel the need to make William proud because that need had become fundamental to her existence. The tragedy is that William never cared. He never noticed. He never acknowledged Elizabeth's desperate attempts to please him, even after her death. She spent years orchestrating plans, surviving rejection, rebuilding herself from scrap parts, all in pursuit of a moment of recognition from her father. And she never got it. William encountered Scrap Baby in Pizzeria Simulator. They were both in that building when it burned. And there's no evidence that he ever acknowledged her as his daughter, ever spoke to her as anything other than another animatronic, ever gave her the validation she sacrificed everything to achieve. She died for him. She became a monster for him, and he never even looked at her with recognition. This is the ultimate tragedy of Elizabeth Afton. Not that she died, not that she was trapped, not even that she became something monstrous. The tragedy is that her entire existence, both before and after death, was defined by seeking love from someone fundamentally incapable of providing it. And no matter what she did, no matter what she became, no matter what she sacrificed, she never received what she needed most. William Afton destroyed Elizabeth through neglect. He built the machine that killed her. He failed to protect her. He kept her trapped. He used her existence as proof of his theories. And he never, not once, gave her the love and validation that would have prevented all of it. There's a deep psychological horror in this that goes beyond jump scares and animatronic monsters. It's the horror of invisible abuse, of emotional neglect, of a child so desperate for parental love that they'll twist themselves into impossible shapes trying to earn it. It's the horror of discovering that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, you'll never be enough for the person whose approval you crave most. Elizabeth Afton's story is ultimately a story about a little girl who loved her father. Everything else, the death, the possession, the manipulation, the violence, stems from that single, simple, tragic fact. She loved William Afton, and it destroyed her. The community's relationship with Elizabeth as a character has evolved significantly since Sister Location's release. Initially, she was primarily understood as Circus Baby, with her human identity being secondary to her role as an animatronic antagonist. But as more details emerged, as her backstory was fleshed out through dialogue and environmental storytelling, the community began to recognize the tragedy beneath the horror. Fan interpretations of Elizabeth range widely. Some see her as purely a victim, stripping away her agency to emphasize the injustice of what happened to her. Others see her as genuinely villainous, focusing on her manipulation of Michael and her willingness to harm others. Most fall somewhere in between, recognizing that Elizabeth is too complex to fit into simple categories. The artistic community has particularly embraced Elizabeth's tragedy, creating animations, artwork, and fan songs that explore her emotional state, her relationship with William, and her gradual transformation from child to machine. These interpretations often humanize her more than the games do, showing her fear, her confusion, her desperate attempts to hold onto her humanity as it slips away. One particularly compelling fan interpretation suggests that Elizabeth's final words in Pizzeria Simulator, "I will make you proud, Daddy," aren't spoken to William at all. In this reading, Elizabeth is speaking to Henry, the father figure who actually cared enough to end her suffering, who noticed her pain enough to include her in his plan for peace, who gave her something William never did, acknowledgement that she deserved to rest. This interpretation isn't supported by explicit canon, but it's thematically powerful. It suggests that in her final moments, Elizabeth transferred her need for approval from William to Henry, recognizing perhaps unconsciously that Henry was offering her something William never would. It reframes her last words from tragic devotion to a father who didn't care into grateful recognition of the father figure who finally set her free. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, it speaks to the community's deep engagement with Elizabeth's emotional arc and their desire to find meaning in her suffering. The FNAF community, for all its theories and debates, consistently returns to the emotional core of the characters, trying to understand their motivations and find significance in their tragedies. Elizabeth matters to the community because her story is relatable on a fundamental level. Most people understand what it's like to seek approval from someone who won't give it. Most people have experienced the pain of loving someone who doesn't love you back the way you need them to. Elizabeth's story takes those universal experiences and amplifies them through the horror lens, creating something that resonates emotionally while still being terrifying. The remaining mysteries surrounding Elizabeth Afton are numerous despite how much we've learned about her over the years. We still don't know exact dates for most of the events in her life and death. We don't know what her relationship with Michael was like before her death, whether they were close or distant or somewhere in between. We don't know if she knew about the crying child's death or how she processed it if she did. We don't know what Elizabeth looked like in life beyond vague descriptions. We don't know how William explained her disappearance to the world, whether he claimed she ran away or died in an accident or simply vanished without explanation. We don't know whether her body remained inside Circus Baby or was eventually removed and buried somewhere. We don't know if Mrs. Afton was alive when Elizabeth died, or if Elizabeth's death was compounded by already losing her mother. We don't know if Michael knew Elizabeth was inside Circus Baby when he worked at the facility, or if he only realized it later, after she'd already scooped him. We don't know exactly how much of Baby's personality was Elizabeth and how much was programming. We don't know if Elizabeth genuinely wanted to hurt Michael, or if she rationalized it as necessary for escape. We don't know if she felt any remorse, any guilt, any recognition of the horror of what she'd become. And most importantly, we don't know if Elizabeth found peace. We don't know if the fire freed her soul or if some fragment remains, trapped in whatever hell follows death in the FNAF universe. We don't know if she ever forgave William or herself, or if forgiveness was even possible for someone so fractured by trauma and transformation. These mysteries are unlikely to ever be fully resolved. Scott Cawthon has moved on to new stories, new characters, new eras of the franchise. Elizabeth's story is largely complete within the context of the original timeline, and while she may appear in various forms in spin-offs and alternate continuities, the core narrative of Elizabeth Afton and Circus Baby has reached its conclusion. But the ambiguity is part of what makes her story so haunting. We're left with fragments, with implications, with questions that force us to engage with the material and draw our own conclusions. Elizabeth exists in the spaces between confirmed fact and speculation, and every player brings their own interpretation to her character. Some see her as a cautionary tale about parental neglect. Others see her as an exploration of how trauma can transform victims into perpetrators. Some focus on the horror of her physical transformation, the body horror of becoming merged with a machine. Others focus on the psychological horror of losing yourself piece by piece, until you can't remember who you were before. All of these interpretations are valid, because Elizabeth's story is deliberately constructed to support multiple readings. She's a complex character in a franchise built on complexity, a tragic figure in a narrative defined by tragedy, a mystery wrapped in questions that may never have definitive answers. What we do know, what remains consistent across every interpretation, is that Elizabeth Afton was failed by the people who should have protected her. She died because her father built something dangerous, and she was never given the support and attention she needed to understand why she should stay away from it. She was transformed into a monster, not through any fault of her own, but because her soul was trapped inside a machine designed to manipulate and deceive. And she spent years, possibly decades, trapped in metal bodies that weren't meant to contain human consciousness, slowly losing herself to programming and isolation, and the desperate, impossible hope that somehow she could still make everything right by earning her father's approval. She never did. She died in fire, either freed at last or trapped in new torment, with her final words still seeking validation from a man who had never been capable of giving it. This is the complete story of Elizabeth Afton, told as completely as the fragmented evidence allows. From her birth into a family defined by genius and dysfunction, through her death inside the machine she loved most, through her transformation into Circus Baby and Ennard and Scrap Baby, to her final moments in Henry's Inferno. It's a story about love twisted by neglect into obsession, about innocence destroyed by curiosity and circumstance, about a soul trapped between humanity and machinery, unable to be either, unable to escape the prison her existence had become. It's a story about a little girl who only wanted her daddy to notice her, who died reaching for something beautiful he created, who became something monstrous in her desperate attempt to make him proud. The story of Elizabeth Afton doesn't exist in isolation. To fully understand her tragedy, we need to examine how her character functions within the broader narrative structure of Five Nights at Freddy's, how she parallels and contrasts with other characters, and what her existence tells us about the themes Scott Cawthon has been exploring throughout the franchise's decade-long history. Elizabeth is one piece of a much larger puzzle, a single thread in a tapestry of interconnected tragedies that span generations. But her thread is particularly significant because it reveals something fundamental about how the FNAF universe operates, about how trauma perpetuates itself across time, and about how the sins of parents are visited upon their children in ways both literal and metaphorical. The most obvious parallel to Elizabeth is Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter, known throughout the franchise as Charlie or the Puppet. Both girls were daughters of the franchise's two founding figures. Both died because of William Afton's actions, directly or indirectly. Both possessed animatronics. Both spent years trapped in mechanical bodies. And both ultimately burned in Henry's final fire. But the differences between Elizabeth and Charlie are just as significant as the similarities, and examining those differences reveals crucial insights into what makes Elizabeth's tragedy unique. Charlie was murdered deliberately. William killed her in a moment of rage, jealousy, or cold calculation. The exact motivation remains unclear, but the act was intentional. He locked her outside Fredbear's family diner in the rain, and when she was vulnerable and alone, he killed her. Her death was an act of violence, a choice William made to destroy something innocent. Elizabeth's death was accidental, at least in the sense that William didn't intend for her to die that specific day in that specific way. He built a machine capable of killing children, yes. He knew it was dangerous, yes. He warned Elizabeth to stay away, yes. But there's no evidence that he wanted Elizabeth to die or that he deliberately lured her to Circus Baby. Her death was the result of neglect and dangerous experimentation rather than active malice. This distinction is important because it shapes how each character responds to their death and possession. Charlie becomes the puppet, a protective entity that watches over other children, that gives life to the animatronics possessed by the missing children, that tries to save others from the fate she suffered. Her possession is defined by altruism twisted into violence, by a desire to protect that manifests as aggression toward anyone she perceives as a threat. Elizabeth becomes Circus Baby, a manipulative entity focused primarily on escape and on earning William's approval. Her possession is defined by obsession and the continuation of psychological patterns established during her life. Where Charlie tries to save others, Elizabeth uses others. Where Charlie's actions are motivated by protection, Elizabeth's actions are motivated by personal need. Neither response is wrong or right in any moral sense. They're both trauma responses, ways that young girls process death and possession through the limited framework available to them. But the differences illustrate how individual psychology shapes supernatural existence in the FNAF universe. Charlie and Elizabeth died in different ways, had different relationships with their fathers, and therefore became different kinds of entities after death. Charlie had a father who loved her. Henry Emily was consumed by grief after her death, dedicating years to trying to make things right, eventually constructing the elaborate plan that would free all the trapped souls. His love for Charlie was genuine, healthy, the kind of parental affection every child deserves. When she died, something in him broke, and his entire life afterward was shaped by the need to honor her memory and end the suffering William had caused. Elizabeth had a father who saw her as peripheral to his real work. William Afton's grief over Elizabeth's death, if he experienced any at all, didn't translate into any meaningful action. He didn't try to free her. He didn't stop his experiments. He didn't fundamentally change his behavior. He simply continued, using Elizabeth's possession as proof of his theories, treating her continued existence as data rather than tragedy. This difference in paternal response shaped both girls' afterlives profoundly. Charlie became protective because she'd experienced genuine love and wanted to extend that protection to others. Elizabeth became obsessive because she'd never received the love she needed and continued seeking it even after death, made that goal impossible to achieve. The parallels between Elizabeth and Charlie extend into the novel trilogy, where their relationship becomes even more complex and psychologically fraught. Novel Charlie is eventually revealed to be a robot, a recreation Henry built to replace his murdered daughter, programmed with false memories and designed to believe she's human. Novel Elizabeth is jealous of this artificial Charlie, resentful of the love and attention Henry poured into creating a replacement daughter, while William barely acknowledged Elizabeth's existence. The novel explores this jealousy in disturbing ways, with Elizabeth wearing Charlie's clothes, trying to inhabit her life, attempting to become the daughter that Henry loved since her own father wouldn't love her. It's a desperate, pathological attempt to receive affection by becoming someone else entirely, by erasing herself and replacing herself with the image of a girl who was loved. This dynamic, while specific to the novels, illuminates something true about Game Elizabeth as well. Her identity was never fully her own. She defined herself in relation to William, shaped herself around what she believed he wanted, tried to become worthy by his standards rather than developing her own sense of self. And when she died and merged with Circus Baby, this pattern intensified. She became literally merged with something William created, her consciousness inseparable from his engineering, her very existence defined by his work. Elizabeth could never escape William because William was built into her on a fundamental level. Not just psychologically, as a daughter shaped by her father's neglect, but literally, as a consciousness merged with machinery he designed. Every thought she had after death was processed through circuits he created. Every action she took was influenced by programming he wrote. She was trapped inside his creation in every possible sense. Charlie, by contrast, chose her animatronic form. The puppet was something she inhabited after death, but her consciousness remained distinct from the animatronic's programming. She used the puppet as a tool, as a vessel, but she wasn't merged with it the way Elizabeth merged with Baby. Charlie maintained more of her individual identity because her possession was different, because the puppet wasn't designed to contain human consciousness the way the Funtime animatronics were. This brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of Elizabeth's tragedy. William designed Circus Baby specifically to capture and contain souls. The blueprints in Sister Location make this clear. The storage tank, the claw mechanism, the entire internal structure was built with possession in mind. William created a machine optimized for trapping human consciousness, and his daughter became the first victim of his design. Whether he intended Elizabeth specifically to become that victim remains one of the most debated questions in the community. The evidence is contradictory. William warned Elizabeth to stay away, suggesting he didn't want her near the animatronic. But he also built Baby with design elements that mirror descriptions of Elizabeth, suggesting some connection between creation and daughter. And he created the underground facility, a private space where his experiments could continue without oversight, a place Elizabeth could access. The most psychologically consistent interpretation is that William was criminally negligent rather than deliberately murderous toward his own daughter. He built something dangerous, failed to secure it properly, failed to give Elizabeth the attention and supervision she needed, and failed to recognize that his warnings wouldn't be enough to keep a desperate, attention-starved child away from something beautiful he'd created. It's the same pattern of neglect that allowed Michael to torment the crying child without intervention, that left the Afton children largely unsupervised, that created an environment where tragedy was inevitable, even if the specific form it took wasn't planned. William was so consumed by his work that he couldn't see the danger he was putting his children in, and by the time he realized what had happened, Elizabeth was already dead and possessing the very machine he'd designed to capture souls. His response to this, keeping Baby operational, continuing his experiments, using Elizabeth's possession as proof of concept, reveals the depth of his dysfunction. A normal parent would be destroyed by accidentally causing their child's death. They would try to fix it, to reverse it, to free their child from suffering no matter the cost. William simply continued working, treating Elizabeth's death as unfortunate but ultimately useful data for his research. This makes William Afton one of the most disturbing villains in gaming, not because he's a serial killer, though he is, but because his evil extends even to his own family. He's not a monster who's kind to his children but cruel to strangers. He's comprehensively monstrous, incapable of genuine love or empathy even toward people who share his blood, who depend on him, who desperately need his affection and protection. And Elizabeth, tragically, never stopped loving him, never stopped trying to earn his approval, never stopped believing that if she could just do enough, be enough, prove herself valuable enough, he would finally look at her the way Henry looked at Charlie, with love, with pride, with genuine paternal affection. She spent her entire existence, both before and after death, chasing something that never existed and never would exist. William Afton was incapable of being the father Elizabeth needed, and no amount of accomplishment or sacrifice or transformation could change that fundamental fact. Another crucial parallel exists between Elizabeth and the missing children, the 5 kids William murdered who went on to possess Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. These children share Elizabeth's experience of possession, of having their souls trapped inside animatronics, of spending years unable to move on from the trauma of their deaths. But the missing children were murdered by William intentionally, lured to a back room and killed in what was likely the moment that transformed him from someone who experimented with life and death into an active serial killer. Their possession was the result of extreme trauma, violent death, and what William would later identify as remnant, the emotional energy released during moments of intense fear and pain that allows souls to bind with physical objects. Elizabeth's possession involved remnant as well, but her emotional state at the moment of death was different from the missing children's. They died in terror, murdered by someone they'd trusted. Elizabeth died in confusion, possibly even excitement, reaching for something she believed was meant for her. Her death was quicker, more mechanical, less psychologically torturous in the immediate moment, even if the long-term consequences were just as severe. This difference in death circumstances might explain why Elizabeth retained more of her individual identity than the missing children seemed to. The missing children, by most interpretations, became almost entirely subsumed by rage and the desire for revenge. They attacked night guards indiscriminately, unable to distinguish between William Afton and innocent people just trying to do a job. Their consciousness has been simplified, reduced to basic emotions, and the drive to kill anyone they perceive as a threat. Elizabeth, by contrast, remained capable of complex planning, manipulation, and goal-directed behavior. She could pretend to be helpful while orchestrating Michael's death. She could work with the other Funtime animatronics to create Ennard. She could rebuild herself into Scrap Baby after being rejected. Her consciousness remained more intact, more functional, more recognizably human even as it merged with Baby's programming. Why the difference? Possibly because Elizabeth's death was less traumatic in the immediate moment. Possibly because Circus Baby was designed specifically to contain consciousness in ways the original animatronics weren't. Possibly because Elizabeth was William's daughter and had some genetic or psychological resilience the missing children lacked. Or possibly simply because Scott Cawthon needed Elizabeth to function as a more complex character for narrative purposes, and the lore explanations were built around that narrative necessity. Regardless of the reason, Elizabeth's form of possession allowed her to remain more herself, which paradoxically made her tragedy deeper. The missing children, simplified to rage and revenge, at least weren't fully aware of what they'd lost. Elizabeth remained aware enough to understand her situation, to remember being human, to recognize the horror of what she'd become. She was trapped with full consciousness of her imprisonment, which is perhaps the worst fate of all. The missing children found a kind of peace in their simplification. They had a clear enemy in William Afton, a clear purpose in preventing him from hurting anyone else, and eventually a clear ending when they were freed by Henry's fire. Their arc was tragic but comprehensible. Innocent victims of a monster, trapped by trauma, eventually released. Elizabeth's arc was more psychologically complex and therefore more disturbing. She was a victim of neglect who became a perpetrator of violence. She was trapped not just by circumstances, but by her own psychological patterns. She harmed her own brother in pursuit of goals that were fundamentally impossible to achieve. And even when offered release through fire, she spent her final moments still seeking approval from the father who'd destroyed her life. There's no simple moral to Elizabeth's story. No clear lesson except perhaps that parental neglect can damage children in ways that extend beyond death, beyond the physical, beyond anything that can be easily repaired or resolved. She's a character designed to make us uncomfortable, to resist easy categorization, to force us to grapple with the complexity of trauma and how it shapes behavior across time. The crying child, Elizabeth's younger brother whose name we still don't know with certainty, provides another crucial parallel. Like Elizabeth, he died because of circumstances related to William's business and the animatronics. Like Elizabeth, his death was witnessed by his siblings. Like Elizabeth, he was failed by William's neglect and absence. But the crying child's possession, if it occurred at all, took a very different form from Elizabeth's. The exact nature of what happened to him after the bite of 83 is one of the most contentious debates in FNAF lore. Did he possess Golden Freddy, the Fredbear plush, something else entirely? Did he even possess anything, or did he simply die and move on? What we do know is that the crying child was afraid of the animatronics in ways Elizabeth never was. He saw them as threats, as monsters, as sources of terror. His final words, delivered through the Fredbear plush, suggest he was broken in fundamental ways even before his death. "I will put you back together," the plush promises, but we don't know if that promise was ever fulfilled or what form that reconstruction might have taken. Elizabeth and the crying child represent two different responses to growing up in the Afton household. The crying child withdrew into fear, became paralyzed by anxiety, saw danger everywhere because danger was everywhere. Elizabeth leaned into seeking approval, became obsessed with pleasing William, saw opportunity in the very things that terrified her brother. Neither strategy protected them. The crying child's fear didn't keep him safe from Michael's bullying or from being bitten. Elizabeth's attempts to earn approval didn't make William love her or prevent her death. Both children were destroyed by the environment William created, just in different ways. Michael, the oldest Afton child and the only one to survive into adulthood, completes the picture of the Afton family's dysfunction. He was a bully who tormented his younger brother. He was likely neglected by William just as much as his siblings were. And he spent decades after his family's deaths trying to undo the damage, working dangerous jobs in haunted locations, tracking down animatronics, and eventually allowing himself to be used as bait in Henry's final trap. Michael's relationship with Elizabeth is particularly complex and largely unexplored in canon. We know Elizabeth manipulated him in sister location. We know she used his body as an escape vehicle. We know she either didn't recognize him as her brother or didn't care. But we don't know what their relationship was like before her death. Were they close? Did Michael bully Elizabeth the way he bullied the crying child? Did Elizabeth admire her older brother or resent him? Did they bond over their shared experience of being ignored by William, or did they compete for what little attention he provided? The fact that Elizabeth showed no hesitation in leading Michael to the scooping room suggests either that they weren't close, that her possession had eroded her ability to care about family bonds, or that her desperation to escape overrode any affection she might have felt. Regardless, the dynamic between them in sister location is purely manipulative. She's the predator, he's the prey, and any shared history they might have had is irrelevant to her goals. Michael, for his part, doesn't seem to recognize Baby as Elizabeth until after the scooping, if he ever recognizes her at all. His dialogue in sister location doesn't suggest he knows who's inside Circus Baby. He might have gone to the facility looking for his sister, following some clue or instruction from William, but there's no moment of recognition, no conversation where they acknowledge each other as siblings. This absence of connection between them is heartbreaking in its own way. Elizabeth and Michael were both victims of William's neglect, both damaged by the Afton family dysfunction, both eventually destroyed by animatronics connected to their father's work. They could have been allies, could have helped each other, could have found some comfort in shared understanding of what it was like to grow up in that house. Instead, they became predator and prey. Elizabeth used Michael without apparent remorse. Michael either didn't know his sister was inside Baby or couldn't reach her if he did know. And both of them ended up in Henry's fire, dying together without ever truly connecting as siblings, without ever addressing the trauma they'd both survived, without ever finding the family connection that might have saved them both. The complete absence of functional family bonds in the Afton household is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire FNAF narrative. William was emotionally absent or actively harmful. Mrs. Afton was gone, one way or another. Michael bullied the crying child to death. Elizabeth manipulated and killed Michael. The crying child died terrified and alone. Every possible family connection was severed, corrupted, or weaponized. This dysfunction wasn't accidental. It was the direct result of William's obsessions taking priority over everything else, including the emotional well-being of his children. He created an environment where love was scarce, attention had to be fought for, and the animatronics received more care and consideration than the children. In such an environment, healthy sibling bonds become almost impossible. Children who are starving for parental attention often can't support each other because they're too busy competing for scraps of affection. The Afton family is a case study in how parental failure cascades through every relationship in a household. William's neglect didn't just damage his individual relationships with each child. It damaged the children's relationships with each other, preventing them from forming the alliances and support systems that might have helped them survive their childhood. And because this is Five Nights at Freddy's, where death isn't an ending and trauma persists through supernatural possession, the damage continued long after everyone died. The Afton children couldn't escape their family dysfunction even in death. They remained trapped by it, defined by it, destroyed by it across decades. This brings us to one of the central themes Elizabeth's story explores: the question of identity and how it's shaped by family, by trauma, and by the bodies we inhabit. Elizabeth's identity was never fully her own. As a living child, she defined herself primarily in relation to William, shaping her personality around earning his approval. After death, she became literally merged with something William created, her consciousness inseparable from Circus Baby's programming. At what point did Elizabeth stop being Elizabeth? When she died, when she merged with Baby's programming, when she spent years in the underground facility and her human memories began degrading, when she became part of Ennard, when she rebuilt herself as Scrap Baby? Or did she remain Elizabeth throughout all of it, simply changing and adapting the way any consciousness changes over time, her core identity persisting even as her circumstances became increasingly inhuman? The philosophical questions raised by Elizabeth's existence are profound. If your consciousness is transferred into a machine, are you still you? If your thoughts are processed through programming you don't control, are your choices truly yours? If you can't remember what it felt like to be human, are you still human in any meaningful sense? These questions apply to all the possessed animatronics in FNAF, but they're particularly acute for Elizabeth because she remained more conscious and functional than most possessed entities. She could plan, manipulate, and pursue complex goals. She retained enough of herself to remember William, to want his approval, to organize elaborate schemes. But she was also clearly changed by possession in ways that made her capable of things human Elizabeth likely never would have done. The fusion between human consciousness and animatronic programming that Elizabeth experienced is a kind of transhumanism, but a horrifying version where the transformation isn't chosen and the result isn't an improvement. Elizabeth didn't consent to becoming Circus Baby. She didn't want to be a machine. She was forced into that existence by circumstance, and the result was a consciousness that was neither fully human nor fully artificial, trapped in an uncomfortable middle ground where she remembered humanity without being able to access it. This is body horror on a psychological level. Physical body horror focuses on the flesh, on transformation and mutation and physical suffering. Psychological body horror focuses on consciousness, on the terror of losing yourself, on remaining aware as you become something you don't recognize. Elizabeth experienced both forms simultaneously. Her physical form became mechanical, inhuman, grotesque, while her consciousness fragmented and merged with programming, until she couldn't distinguish her own thoughts from Baby's directives. And unlike horror stories where transformation is temporary or reversible, Elizabeth's transformation was permanent. There was no way to extract her consciousness from Baby's programming, no way to restore her to human form, no way to undo the fusion. She was trapped in that state forever, or at least until fire destroyed the physical substrate her consciousness was bound to. The question of whether that fire freed her, or simply ended her existence, is another profound philosophical problem. If consciousness requires a physical substrate to exist, did destroying Scrap Baby's body simply delete Elizabeth's consciousness? Or does the FNAF universe operate on dualist principles, where souls exist independently of physical form, in which case destroying the body would release the soul too? Wherever souls go, Henry clearly believed the latter. His entire plan in Pizzeria Simulator was built on the assumption that burning the animatronics would free the souls trapped inside them, allowing them to finally rest. He speaks directly to those souls, telling them they can finally be at peace, suggesting he believes consciousness persists beyond the physical, and that destroying the animatronic bodies will release rather than destroy the entities within. But Henry could be wrong. His plan might be based on hope rather than knowledge. The souls might have been so thoroughly integrated with the animatronics that destroying the machines simply ended their existence without any peaceful transition. We don't have definitive evidence either way. For Elizabeth specifically, this ambiguity is torturous to consider. If Henry was right, then she finally found peace, finally escaped the metal prison she'd been trapped in for so long, finally moved beyond the obsession with William that had defined her entire existence. She would be free in whatever sense souls can be free in the FNAF universe. But if Henry was wrong, then Elizabeth's final moments in the fire were moments of pure terror as she felt her consciousness fragmenting, her memories dissolving, everything that remained of the little girl who reached for ice cream disappearing into nothing. She would have ceased to exist entirely. No peace, no rest, just deletion. We'll likely never know which interpretation is correct, and perhaps that's intentional. The ambiguity forces us to grapple with the same uncertainty the characters face, the same lack of concrete answers about what happens after death, what consciousness really is, and whether there's any redemption or peace possible for those who have suffered as Elizabeth suffered. What we can say with certainty is that Elizabeth's existence, whether it ended in peace or oblivion, was tragic from beginning to end. She was born into a dysfunctional family. She developed unhealthy psychological patterns in response to neglect. She died because of her father's creations. She was trapped for years in conditions that gradually destroyed her humanity. She became capable of terrible acts in pursuit of impossible goals. And she died, truly died, finally died, still seeking approval from someone who never cared. There's a particular cruelty in that final detail that makes Elizabeth's story almost unbearably sad. Her last words, her last thoughts, her last emotional focus was still on William. After everything she'd experienced, after all the years and transformations and failures, she remained fundamentally unchanged in the one way that mattered most. She was still the little girl who wanted her daddy to notice her. This is what trauma does. It freezes people at the moment of deepest pain, creating psychological loops they can't escape no matter how much time passes or how much circumstances change. Elizabeth was frozen at the moment she decided that earning William's approval was the most important thing in her life, and she never progressed beyond that point. Everything else changed, her body, her capabilities, her circumstances, but that core psychological pattern remained exactly the same. In this sense, Elizabeth was more trapped by her psychology than by any physical prison. Even if she'd escaped the underground facility, even if she'd successfully used Michael's body to blend into human society, even if she'd achieved every practical goal she set for herself, she would still have been imprisoned by her need for William's approval. That need was the real cage, and there was no key that could open it. Only death, final, complete death, could potentially break that pattern. And even then, we don't know if it worked. If any part of Elizabeth persists after the fire, if her consciousness survived in any form, there's no guarantee she's free from the obsession that defined her. She might still be seeking William's approval in whatever realm she now inhabits, still trapped by the same psychological patterns, still unable to move beyond the trauma that shaped her. This is the ultimate horror of Elizabeth Afton's story. Not the death, not the possession, not the physical transformations. The real horror is that a little girl was so damaged by parental neglect that she couldn't escape it even after death, even after becoming something inhuman, even after burning in fire meant to free her. The horror is that love, twisted by dysfunction into obsession, became a prison stronger than any metal chassis. And William Afton, the source of all this suffering, likely never understood or cared about the damage he caused his daughter. He was too consumed by his own obsessions to notice hers, too detached to recognize how desperately she needed him, too fundamentally broken to provide the basic emotional support that might have saved her. The tragedy of Elizabeth Afton is ultimately the tragedy of a child who needed love and received machinery instead, who died reaching for something beautiful and became trapped inside it, who spent decades trying to earn approval that was never coming, who burned still believing that somehow, impossibly, she could make her daddy proud. She couldn't. She never could have, because the problem was never Elizabeth. It was always William. Elizabeth Afton's story exists not just as an individual tragedy, but as a lens through which we can understand the entire thematic architecture of Five Nights at Freddy's. Her arc touches on nearly every major theme Scott Cawthon has explored throughout the franchise: the corruption of innocence, the cycle of trauma, the horror of consciousness trapped in inhuman forms, the question of redemption for those who have become monsters, and perhaps most importantly, the way obsession destroys everything it touches. The corruption of innocence is perhaps the most visually obvious theme Elizabeth embodies. Circus Baby's design is deliberately constructed to emphasize this corruption. She's designed to appeal to children with her bright colors, her cheerful voice, her ice cream dispenser. She looks like she should be entertaining kids at birthday parties, spreading joy and creating happy memories. But hidden inside that colorful exterior is a killing mechanism, a storage tank for bodies, machinery designed to destroy the very innocence it appears to celebrate. This juxtaposition, innocent exterior concealing deadly interior, is replicated throughout FNAF's animatronic designs. Freddy Fazbear looks friendly until he's hunting you through dark hallways. Bonnie's guitar becomes threatening when wielded by something that wants you dead. Even the puppet, despite being possessed by the protective spirit of Charlotte Emily, is deeply unsettling in appearance and behavior. But Elizabeth's corruption goes deeper than visual design. Her innocence was corrupted not just by becoming an animatronic, but by the gradual erosion of her moral framework, as she spent years trapped in Baby's body. The Elizabeth who died was a child who'd never deliberately hurt anyone. The Elizabeth who became Baby was capable of manipulation, deception, and eventually murder. The transformation from innocent victim to active perpetrator is one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of her character. This transformation raises uncomfortable questions about culpability and moral responsibility. If trauma and circumstance can transform a victim into a perpetrator, how much blame can we assign to their actions? Elizabeth didn't choose to become Circus Baby. She didn't choose to be trapped underground for years. She didn't choose to have her consciousness merged with programming that prioritized deception and escape above all else. But she did choose to manipulate Michael. She did choose to lead him to the scooping room. She did participate in his murder. Where's the line between victim and villain? At what point does suffering stop excusing harmful behavior? These questions don't have easy answers, and Elizabeth's story deliberately refuses to provide them. She exists in moral ambiguity, forcing us to hold multiple truths simultaneously. She was horribly victimized and she victimized others. She deserves sympathy and she committed unforgivable acts. She was a child who needed help and she became a monster who caused terrible harm. This moral complexity is central to what makes FNAF storytelling effective. Scott Cawthon consistently refuses to provide simple heroes and villains. Even William Afton, the franchise's primary antagonist, has moments that suggest he might have started with genuinely innovative intentions before his obsessions corrupted him. Henry Emily, positioned as the moral authority who ends the cycle of violence, also bears responsibility for creating the technologies William weaponized. The missing children are sympathetic victims who nonetheless murder innocent night guards. And Elizabeth is perhaps the most morally complex of all because her victimization and her perpetration are so intimately connected. She became capable of evil specifically because of the evil done to her. Her transformation from victim to villain wasn't a separate development but a direct consequence of her trauma. This makes her simultaneously more sympathetic and more disturbing than characters whose villainy has clearer origins. The cycle of trauma is another major theme Elizabeth's story illuminates. Trauma in the FNAF universe doesn't end with the traumatized individual. It spreads, infects others, creates cascading consequences that extend across generations. William's trauma, whatever original wound created his obsessions, spread to his entire family. It killed his daughter. It transformed his sons. It destroyed everyone he touched. But the cycle doesn't stop there. Elizabeth's trauma spread to Michael when she killed him. Michael's trauma, originating from killing his brother and being scooped, motivated him to spend decades hunting animatronics and eventually participating in Henry's final plan. The missing children's trauma spread to every night guard who worked at locations they haunted. Charlie's trauma spread through her actions as the puppet. Each traumatic event creates ripples that spread outward, touching more lives, creating more trauma, generating more violence in a cycle that perpetuates itself across time. This is why Henry's final solution was so drastic. He recognized that the cycle couldn't be broken through partial measures. The only way to end it was to destroy everything connected to it, burning away all the accumulated trauma and remnant and possessed machinery in one final conflagration. Whether his plan actually worked remains questionable. The newer game suggests that something survived, that the cycle continues in new forms, that perhaps trauma runs too deep to ever be completely purged. But Henry's attempt represented a recognition that trauma has to be addressed systemically rather than individually, that you can't save one possessed child without addressing the entire network of pain and obsession, and supernatural corruption they are embedded in. Elizabeth was one node in that network, connected to William through her obsession, to Michael through her manipulation of him, to the other funtime animatronics through Ennard, to the missing children through shared experience of possession, to Charlie through parallel positions as daughters of the franchise's founding fathers. She couldn't be saved in isolation because her existence was fundamentally relational, defined by connections to others, and to the larger system of trauma William created. This interconnectedness is part of what makes FNAF's storytelling so rich and complex. No character exists in isolation. Every tragedy is connected to other tragedies. Every choice has consequences that ripple outward in unexpected ways. Elizabeth's death led to her possession, which led to the underground facility remaining sealed, which led to her years in isolation, which led to her manipulation of Michael, which led to Ennard, which led to her eventual arrival at Henry's Pizzeria, which led to her death in the fire, which possibly led to her participation in tormenting William in Ultimate Custom Night. Each step in this sequence was influenced by choices made by multiple people across multiple time frames. William's choice to build Circus Baby, Elizabeth's choice to approach her despite warnings, Michael's choice to work at the rental facility, Henry's choice to end everything in fire. None of these individuals acted in complete isolation. Their choices were responses to previous choices, reactions to circumstances created by others, links in a chain that stretched back to whatever original trauma set William on his dark path. Understanding Elizabeth's story requires understanding this entire chain of causation, recognizing that her tragedy wasn't a singular event, but the culmination of countless smaller failures, neglects, and destructive choices made by people who couldn't see the full consequences of their actions. The question of consciousness and identity that Elizabeth's existence raises has profound implications for how we understand the FNAF universe's metaphysics. If souls can be bound to objects, if consciousness can be transferred between substrates, if remnant can preserve identity beyond death, then what is identity? What makes someone themselves? Elizabeth challenges these questions in unique ways because her identity became so thoroughly merged with Circus Baby's programming. She wasn't a ghost haunting a machine. She wasn't a separate entity controlling an animatronic from within. She was genuinely fused with Baby, her human consciousness integrated with artificial intelligence in ways that made separation impossible. This fusion creates philosophical problems that the FNAF narrative never fully resolves. If Elizabeth's thoughts after possession were processed through Baby's programming, were they truly her thoughts? If her decisions were influenced by directives she didn't consciously choose, was she morally responsible for those decisions? If she couldn't distinguish her own memories from Baby's operational parameters, did she have free will in any meaningful sense? These questions extend beyond Elizabeth to every possessed animatronic in the franchise, but they're most acute in her case because she remained so functional after possession. The missing children seem to have lost most of their individual personalities, reduced to rage and basic drives. Charlie, as the puppet, retained more awareness, but still operated on relatively simple principles. Elizabeth retained complex planning abilities, long-term memory, and goal-directed behavior, making her the most cognitively intact possessed entity we encounter. But this cognitive intactness came with the horror of awareness. She knew what she'd become. She remembered being human. She understood that she was trapped in a machine, merged with programming, fundamentally changed from what she'd been. That awareness made her suffering more acute than it would have been if she'd simply lost consciousness and been replaced by something else. There's a particular cruelty in remaining aware as you lose yourself. If possession had simply deleted Elizabeth and replaced her with Circus Baby, there would be tragedy in the loss but no suffering for Elizabeth herself. She'd simply cease to exist. But because elements of Elizabeth persisted, because she remained partially aware throughout her transformation, she experienced the horror of gradual dissolution while being unable to stop it. This is existential horror of the highest order. It's not the horror of death, which is at least final. It's the horror of losing yourself slowly, piece by piece, while remaining aware enough to understand what's happening but powerless to prevent it. It's watching yourself become something you don't recognize while some core part of you screams in protest. trapped inside a body that no longer obeys you, processing thoughts through systems that distort everything you once were. And perhaps worst of all, it's the inability to know where you end and the machine begins. Elizabeth couldn't clearly distinguish her own thoughts from Baby's programming. She couldn't identify which impulses were genuinely hers and which were artificial directives. She existed in a state of profound confusion about her own identity, never certain whether she was Elizabeth pretending to be Baby, Baby pretending to be Elizabeth, or something entirely new that could never be either. This identity confusion is reflected in how Baby speaks about Elizabeth. She refers to Elizabeth in third person sometimes, as if describing someone else. I still hear her sometimes. This suggests Baby perceives Elizabeth as separate, as another voice she can hear. But other times, Baby speaks in first person about events from Elizabeth's life, suggesting integration rather than separation. The inconsistency isn't a writing error. It's an accurate representation of fractured consciousness that can't maintain a stable sense of self. Human consciousness relies on narrative continuity. We maintain identity across time by telling ourselves a story about who we are, connecting past experiences to present circumstances to future goals through a coherent self-narrative. Elizabeth's ability to maintain that narrative was shattered by possession. Her past self was human, her present self was mechanical, and those two states were so radically different that creating coherent narrative between them became almost impossible. Who was she? The girl who reached for ice cream. The animatronic who killed that girl. Something born from the fusion of both, all of these, none of these. The inability to answer these questions would be psychologically devastating, creating a profound sense of unreality and disconnection from existence itself. Yet somehow, through all this confusion and fragmentation, one element of Elizabeth's identity remained stable: her need to make William proud. This suggests that identity isn't equally distributed across all traits and memories. Some elements are more fundamental than others, more resistant to erosion, more deeply embedded in the core of who we are. For Elizabeth, her relationship with William, or more specifically her desperate need for his approval, was that foundational element. Everything else could change. Her body could become mechanical, her memories could fragment, her moral framework could deteriorate, her sense of self could shatter into confusion. But that core need for William's approval persisted through every transformation, every trauma, every failure. It was the one constant in an existence defined by horrifying change. This persistence reveals something profound about trauma and psychological damage. The wounds cut deepest in childhood, the needs left most desperately unfulfilled during formative years, become part of our foundational identity in ways that later experiences can't easily overwrite. Elizabeth needed William's love during the crucial period when children develop their sense of self-worth and their understanding of their place in the world. That need went unfulfilled, creating a wound so deep that it became load-bearing in her psychological structure. When possession stripped away everything else, that wound remained because it had become inseparable from her core identity. Elizabeth couldn't stop needing William's approval because that need had become who she was on the most fundamental level. It wasn't a trait she possessed. It was the foundation on which her entire sense of self was constructed. This is simultaneously the most human and most tragic element of her character. It's human because we all carry wounds from childhood. All have needs that went unfulfilled. All built our identities around the responses we developed to early trauma. It's tragic because Elizabeth's particular wound was so deep and so unfulfillable that it destroyed her across multiple lifetimes, transforming her into something monstrous while never bringing her any closer to the approval she craved. The broader FNAF narrative is filled with characters driven by similar, unfulfillable needs. William seeks understanding of life and death that remains forever beyond his grasp. Henry seeks redemption for failing to protect Charlie, driving him to increasingly drastic measures. Michael seeks to undo the damage he caused, pursuing atonement that can never fully erase his guilt. The missing children seek revenge against William, but can never achieve the justice that would actually heal them. Everyone in FNAF is chasing something they can't have, driven by needs that can never be satisfied, trapped in cycles that can't be broken through achievement or willpower alone. Elizabeth is simply the most pure distillation of this theme, a character whose entire existence, before and after death, was devoted to pursuing something that never existed and never could exist. Elizabeth's impact on the FNAF community and fan culture has been substantial, though perhaps less visible than characters like William Afton or the puppet. She represents a particular kind of tragedy that resonates deeply with certain segments of the fan base, particularly those interested in the psychological and emotional dimensions of the story, rather than just the horror elements. Fan artists have created countless interpretations of Elizabeth, exploring what she might have looked like in life, imagining moments from her childhood, depicting her gradual transformation from girl to machine. These artistic works often emphasize her innocence and the cruelty of her fate, presenting her as a sympathetic figure destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Fan fiction writers have explored her psychology in depth, imagining her internal experience of possession, creating scenarios where she interacts with other characters, constructing alternate timelines where she survives or is saved. Many of these stories focus on her relationship with William, examining the psychology of seeking love from someone incapable of providing it, exploring what might have happened if William had been a better father. The voice acting community has created numerous interpretations of Baby's monologues, each finding different emotional resonances in her dialogue. Some emphasize Baby's manipulation and cold calculation. Others emphasize the underlying sadness, the hints of the little girl still trapped inside. The best performances capture both simultaneously, the monster and the victim existing in the same voice, unable to be separated. Music creators have written songs from Elizabeth's perspective, exploring her emotional state before death, during possession, and in her final moments. These songs often capture the tragedy of her situation more effectively than analysis can, using melody and lyrics to convey the profound sadness of a child who only wanted to be loved. The community's engagement with Elizabeth reveals something important about why FNAF has endured for so long beyond its initial success. The franchise could have remained purely a horror game about surviving nights against murderous animatronics. But Scott Cawthon embedded deep psychological and emotional complexity into the narrative, creating characters whose tragedies resonate on human levels despite the supernatural circumstances. Elizabeth isn't frightening because she's a killer robot. She's frightening because she represents something psychologically true: the horror of unfulfilled childhood needs, the tragedy of seeking love from those who can't provide it, the way trauma can transform victims into perpetrators without erasing their victimhood. These are real psychological phenomena that many people have experienced in less extreme forms, making Elizabeth's story feel emotionally authentic despite its fantastic elements. This emotional authenticity is what separates FNAF from countless other horror games that have come and gone without leaving lasting cultural impact. The animatronics aren't just monsters. They're vessels for genuine human tragedy, representations of pain and trauma and unfulfilled needs that persist beyond death. Understanding their stories requires engaging with complex emotional and psychological concepts, treating them as characters rather than just obstacles. Elizabeth exemplifies this approach. Her story could have been simple: girl dies, possesses animatronic, kills people, gets destroyed. Instead, it's layered with psychological complexity, moral ambiguity, and emotional depth that rewards careful analysis and emotional engagement. She's a character you can spend hours thinking about, discussing, interpreting, and never fully exhaust because the narrative deliberately leaves space for multiple readings and personal interpretation. The mysteries that remain surrounding Elizabeth are numerous and unlikely to ever be fully resolved. We don't know her exact age at death, though context suggests she was fairly young, probably between 5 and 10 years old. We don't know the exact year she died, though it was likely sometime in the mid to late 1980s based on timeline reconstructions. We don't know how long she was trapped in the underground facility before sister location, though evidence suggests multiple years at minimum. We don't know the full nature of her relationship with Mrs. Afton, or whether her mother was alive when she died. We don't know if Elizabeth knew about the crying child's death, or how she processed it if she did. We don't know if she had friends, interests, hobbies, or personality traits beyond her relationship with William. The narrative focuses so intensely on her father issues that we get almost no sense of who Elizabeth might have been as a complete person. We don't know if she recognized Michael at the rental facility, or if possession had degraded her memory to the point where she couldn't identify him. We don't know if she felt any remorse for what she did to him, or if the fusion with Baby's programming had eroded her capacity for guilt. We don't know what she thought about during the years she spent as Scrap Baby, whether she questioned her choices or remained committed to her goals. Most importantly, we don't know if she found peace after the fire or if some part of her consciousness persists in torment. Ultimate Custom Night suggests the latter possibility but doesn't confirm it. Security Breach and its DLC have introduced new lore but haven't clarified Elizabeth's ultimate fate. The question of whether she was truly freed remains unanswered, leaving her arc without definitive closure. These mysteries frustrate some fans who want concrete answers and clear resolution, but they also allow Elizabeth's story to remain alive in the community's imagination, permitting endless interpretation and discussion. Every unanswered question is an invitation to theorize, to imagine, to construct possible narratives that fill the gaps. Some fans theorize that Elizabeth is the spirit haunting Vanessa in Security Breach, continuing her pattern of manipulation with a new victim. Others believe she was completely destroyed in the fire and plays no role in the modern timeline. Some think her consciousness fragmented across multiple animatronics, while others believe she achieved some form of peace and closure we simply don't see depicted. None of these theories can be definitively proven or disproven based on current evidence, which means they all remain viable interpretations. This openness is intentional on Scott Cawthon's part. He's consistently refused to provide complete answers, preferring to leave room for community interpretation and speculation. Elizabeth's ambiguous fate is consistent with this approach, allowing her story to mean different things to different people. For some, Elizabeth represents the ultimate tragedy of parental failure, a child destroyed by neglect, unable to escape her need for approval even after death. For others, she represents the danger of obsession and how it can transform us into things we never intended to become. For still others, she's a cautionary tale about the corruption of innocence and the way trauma perpetuates itself across generations. All of these interpretations are supported by the text. All of them illuminate different aspects of her character, and all of them contribute to our understanding of the larger themes FNAF explores about family, trauma, obsession, and the supernatural consequences of human evil. Perhaps the most enduring question surrounding Elizabeth is whether she could have been saved. If William had been a better father, if he'd given her the attention and love she needed, if he'd properly secured his dangerous creations, if he'd supervised his children instead of leaving them to raise themselves, would Elizabeth have survived? Would she have grown up to be a healthy, functional adult instead of dying and transforming into a monster? The answer is almost certainly yes. Elizabeth's tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was the direct result of choices William made and attention he didn't provide. In an alternate timeline where William prioritized his children over his work, where he recognized Elizabeth's desperate need for approval and addressed it with genuine affection, where he kept Circus Baby secured or better, yet never built her in the first place, Elizabeth could have lived a normal life. But that's not the timeline we have. In the timeline we're given, William was exactly who he was: brilliant, obsessed, emotionally detached, fundamentally incapable of providing what his children needed. And in that timeline, Elizabeth's tragedy was perhaps not inevitable but certainly probable, the natural consequence of a desperate child seeking love from someone who couldn't provide it. This raises uncomfortable questions about determinism and choice in the FNAF universe. How much of the tragedy was the result of individual choices, and how much was the inevitable outcome of character traits and psychological patterns that couldn't be easily changed? Could William have chosen to be a better father, or was his obsessive personality so fundamental to who he was that different choices were impossible? Could Elizabeth have chosen not to approach Circus Baby, or was her desperate need for William's approval so overwhelming that disobeying his warnings was psychologically inevitable? Could Michael have chosen not to bully his brother, or was his behavior the predictable result of being raised in a neglectful household where violence went unpunished? These questions don't have clear answers, but they're worth asking because they help us understand the characters as complex psychological entities rather than simple moral categories. Everyone in the Afton family made terrible choices that led to tragedy, but those choices emerged from psychological patterns, trauma responses, and character traits that weren't entirely under conscious control. This doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility. William is still culpable for his neglect and his dangerous creations. Elizabeth still chose to manipulate Michael. Michael still killed his brother. But it adds layers of understanding that make the tragedy feel more human, more real, more applicable to our own experiences of family dysfunction and the way trauma shapes behavior. The complete story of Elizabeth Afton is ultimately a story about how damage perpetuates itself, how unfulfilled needs can destroy us from within, and how the love we need most desperately is often the love we'll never receive. She was born into a family that couldn't nurture her, developed psychological patterns in response to neglect, died because of her father's creations, and spent years trapped in forms that gradually destroyed whatever humanity she retained. She manipulated and killed her own brother in a desperate attempt to escape. She was rejected by the entities she'd allied with and forced to rebuild herself alone. She arrived at Henry's Pizzeria still pursuing the same impossible goal that had defined her entire existence, making William proud. And she died in fire, either freed at last or trapped in new forms of torment, with her final words still seeking approval from the father who destroyed her life. It's a tragedy without redemption, without happy endings, without the comfort of justice or resolution. Elizabeth was victimized throughout her entire existence, before and after death, and she never received healing or closure or even acknowledgement of her suffering. She simply continued hurting until she was destroyed, taking her pain with her into whatever comes after fire consumes remnant and metal, and the supernatural bonds that hold souls to machines. But her story resonates because it touches on something fundamentally human: the need to be seen, to be valued, to matter to the people who matter most to us. Every person who's ever felt invisible to a parent, who's ever sought approval that never came, who's ever tried desperately to earn love from someone incapable of providing it, can recognize something of themselves in Elizabeth's tragedy. She's not just a character in a horror game. She's a representation of real psychological pain, real family dysfunction, real trauma transformed into supernatural horror, but never losing its emotional truth. Her story is fantastic in its details but authentic in its emotional core, making it powerful despite and because of its impossible elements. This is why Elizabeth Afton matters. This is why her story deserves deep analysis and emotional engagement. This is why the community continues discussing her years after Sister Location's release. Not because she's the most important character in FNAF's sprawling narrative, but because she represents something true about pain, about family, about the way childhood wounds can shape entire lives and afterlives. She was a little girl who wanted her daddy to love her. She died because he built something beautiful and dangerous and didn't protect her from it. She became something monstrous in her attempt to escape the prison his creation had become. And she burned still believing that somehow, impossibly, she could make him proud. She never could. The problem was never Elizabeth. It was always William. But Elizabeth couldn't see that because children blame themselves for their parents' failures, because victims internalize the abuse they suffer. Because, when you're desperate for love, you'll convince yourself that you're the problem rather than accepting that the person you need simply can't provide what you require. This psychological pattern destroyed Elizabeth Afton across multiple lifetimes. It transformed her from victim to perpetrator, without ever resolving the underlying wound that motivated everything she did. It kept her trapped more securely than any metal chassis could, bound her more completely than any remnant-based possession, and ultimately defined her existence more thoroughly than any choice she made after dying. The tragedy of Elizabeth Afton is the tragedy of unfulfillable need, of love sought from those who cannot provide it, of childhood wounds that become foundational to identity and can never be healed because they're too deeply embedded in who we are. It's the tragedy of being transformed by trauma into something you never chose to become, of losing yourself piece by piece while remaining aware enough to mourn the loss, of spending your entire existence pursuing something that never existed and never would. And perhaps most tragically of all, it's the story of dying truly, finally dying, without ever receiving what you needed most, without resolution or healing or peace, still trapped by the same psychological patterns that destroyed you in life. Elizabeth Afton wanted to make her daddy proud. She died trying. She became a monster trying. She burned trying. And she never succeeded because success was impossible from the beginning. That's the complete story of Elizabeth Afton, a tragedy without redemption, a victim who became a perpetrator, a child who never escaped childhood even after death, a soul trapped in metal, then in obsession, then perhaps in nothing at all. She deserved better. She deserved a father who loved her, a childhood free from neglect, a life that wasn't cut short by dangerous machinery, and a death that brought peace instead of decades of suffering. She deserved to be more than a cautionary tale about parental failure and the way trauma perpetuates itself. But she didn't get what she deserved. She got what the Afton family always got: tragedy, transformation, and an ending that resolved nothing while destroying everything. This is Five Nights at Freddy's at its most psychologically complex and emotionally devastating. This is horror that transcends jump scares and survival mechanics to touch on genuine human pain. This is why the franchise endures, why the community remains engaged, why these stories about haunted animatronics continue resonating years after their release. Because underneath the supernatural elements, underneath the possessed robots and remnant mechanics and impossible resurrections, there are true stories about human suffering, family dysfunction, trauma and its consequences, and the terrible things people become when their deepest needs go unfulfilled. Elizabeth Afton is one of those true stories, dressed in the costume of horror but authentic in its emotional core. She's a little girl who wanted to be loved. And that simple, human need destroyed her in ways that no monster ever could.